With that, then, I'm going to turn the time over to Nathan Pienkowski from Bull City Learning, and Nathan is going to be talking to us about evaluation and program design, and we will go from there. Nathan.
I have with me in this bag, well, actually, let me ask everybody. Raise your hand if you like chocolate. Who likes chocolate? Raise your hand if you don't like chocolate. All right. For those of you who just raised your hand, you may be a little bit disappointed in this presentation, or you might just go ahead and start your nap right now. But for the rest of you, I have chocolate here, and there's going to be an opportunity for you all to earn some chocolate during this presentation. So yesterday when I was talking, I did a lot of the talking. And I'll do a little bit of talking today, but really more than anything, what I wanted to do was to get some dialogue going and get some discussion going and to get your all thoughts. So really what I'm going to be doing here is putting some ideas out there with the main intention of provoking a response from you guys. And because I can't depend on the force of my own personality or the interest of my content to get you guys to react, I'm going to resort to bribery, okay? So there will be moments when we're going to have an opportunity to earn a little bit of chocolate, all right? So today's talk is about evaluation, and rather than just start talking about some ideas, I wanted to put up a case study here. This is all fictional, of course. And I want us to ponder this for a minute. I'll read through this. And in a moment, you all are going to have an opportunity to work together at each table. Each table is going to, in this particular case, you're all going to be working together as a team. And I'm going to present a few options for evaluation plans. And I'm going to ask you all to discuss it and pick one of the options that I give you. And then we're going to come back and have a conversation about it. And this is all going to lead somewhere. I think that in the end, you all are going to need to draw a lot of your own conclusions about what this all means and what it means for you. So, the head of the health ministry in the fictional country of Kakajiristan wants to make sure that the supervisors overseeing health services in all of the country's states are equipped with the basic managerial skills needed to lead their teams. As such, the minister hired a firm that specializes in training for frontline managers to facilitate a one-week training session. The state-level managers will all travel to the capital to participate. Okay? That's the program. So, I'm going to walk through some options, and I just want you to be thinking about each one. Each option is one of the options that I'm going to ask you to decide upon, and you only get to choose one for the purposes of conversation. Or like someone might go, what if we wanted to do two of them? Well, in reality, that's a possibility, but for the sake of conversation, I'm going to have you choose one, so pay attention here. So, option one is we administer a survey at the end of the course to see whether managers felt the course was effective. Did the managers think it was effective? In addition to that, administer a test at the end to measure recall and understanding of the key topics. And conduct a role play at the end of the course to see if managers can apply these skills. So this is option one, doing all of these things, okay? Option two, observe managers in the field 3 months after training to measure the extent to which they put the skills into practice. Have learners complete a survey 3 months after training, indicating the extent to which they feel they are applying their skills in the field. Okay, so this is option two. And I'll put these up again so that when you're deliberating, you'll be able to refer back to them. Option three, and there's only 4 options. So option 3, 6 months after training, measure turnover of the manager's staff and compare that to a baseline. 6 months after training, ask direct reports of the managers, how satisfied they are with their managers, and compare that to a baseline. 6 months after training, measure the productivity of the direct reports of those managers versus a baseline. Okay, that's the third option. And then the fourth option is 12 months after training, measure patient outcomes in each state. 12 months after training, measure patient satisfaction. And 12 months after training, measure operational efficiency. These are the 4 options. So I'm hoping this is, you all can read this. If not, while you're deliberating, you can feel free to walk up here and take a closer look. But what I'm going to do now is, again, each of your tables, you guys are a team. And what I want you to do is take maybe 3 minutes. I'll give you 3 minutes, 5 if we need more, to just discuss it amongst yourselves. But you need to settle on one of the options. In this case, I'm only giving you can only choose one. And so, and when you're done, I'm going to ask a few of you, as many of you as I can, to tell me what you think the best option is and to explain why. Why you think this is the best option. Okay? Before we get going, does anyone have any questions about the task? Is everyone clear on the task? Okay. And the clock starts now. Okay. Okay. All right. So now what I'm going to do, each table has one. You have to have chosen one of these. So what I'm going to do is I just want to ask, raise your hand, and you can just choose one person from the table if you want, but raise your hand if your table selected option 1. Okay. Raise your hand if your table selected option 2. All right, so that's almost a lot of people at least. All right, what about option 3? Did anyone settle on option 3? Okay, we've got a few who did. And how about option 4? All right, so we've got option 4. Okay, so basically we were kind of primarily around option 2, a little bit in option 3, 1 on option 4, and no one chose option 1. All right, so now what I'm going to do, and here's where I want anyone to stand up and tell me why. Why not option 1? Why did we not choose option 1? So whoever volunteers to talk gets a chocolate, all right? So why not? Okay, over here. You just want the chocolate, right? Yes.
So it's option 1 that's going to give you the understanding what's going to happen in the field. And it just also not show you how much every person that have been trained have assimilated and understand what to do in the field.
Okay.
So that's why we knock that one out completely.
Okay.
Because the requirement is for him to do something that can be delivered to others.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other comments about option 1? Yes. Here we go. Enjoy your chocolate.
So option 1, we felt that, yeah, it measures more knowledge difference, but it doesn't measure skill. And what is required is to know whether these people have the managerial skills or not. So doing option 1 cannot show whether that knowledge will translate to skill.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments about option 1?
Yesterday, we learned that knowledge should translate to behavior. I don't think that takes place immediately. So what you're assessing in option 1 is satisfaction and about the course, not about the skills and practice.
Okay. All right. Now let's ask, for those of you who did not choose option 2, why did you not choose option 2? For those who picked option 3, anybody? Do we have? Well, it looks like you're volunteering her to answer this. All right. You can hold the chocolate.
Just to say, I think option 2 is valuable. It's a good thing to do because you measure whether the behavior change as you design it is taking place in the field or not, but you don't measure the effectiveness of that behavior change because you don't know what's happening in the team that it needs to be reflected. I think it is good, but it's not complete.
Okay. Any other comments?
It says we observe the managers in the field 3 months after training. I think, or we think, 3 months is too short because it's a behavioral change we're looking for, acquiring managerial skills. So 3 months, yes, they will have the knowledge, but it wouldn't have translated to behavioral change.
Okay. Okay, so there's some thoughts on option 2. And let's take a look at option 3. Oh, yes, here.
We felt like in addition, option 2 will give also to make corrective action, because if we go down to 6 months or beyond that, we felt like we won't be able to know progress and at the same time to make it.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about option 3. For someone who didn't choose option 3, why not? Why not option 3?
Well, so we had a lot of discussion in the table in terms of option 2 or option 3. So we went with the duration part, 6 months should be definitely available. The only reason why we moved out from option 3 was because staff turnover is not only the outcome of training. It may have many confounding factors. So that was one. Second one was that how satisfied they are with their managers and compared to baseline. So baseline we are not aware when are we doing the baseline. Is it being after the training, before the training? That clarity in the question was not available. So because of that we opted that okay, first we'll go with option 2 followed by option 3. Not
I see. You explicitly did what I said you weren't supposed to do. Okay.
For us, if you are measuring basic managerial skills, if you wait 6 months to measure that, you miss a lot of issues because you need to start early in case he or she did not internalize those skills that you give. You will have the opportunity to mentor him and then do a quick fix of what might have been missing. And if he has not translated those skills into action, you also need to find out why he's not translating them into action.
Okay, good. These are all good points. And all right, I just want to hear some perspectives on option 4. Yet again, option 4 was not a popular choice, although there were people who spoke. Did you want to talk about why you chose it? Okay.
In my opinion, the outcome of the training can be assessed. We have to give certain times to manage, understand, and as well as implement. 12 months is the ideal time on which the performance can be well. This is number 1 point. Number 2, the purpose of the training is ultimately the client satisfaction, the turnaround of the clients for which the training has been organized. So option 4 has so many things about the number of the children coming for immunization. That's why I think the option 4 is the best option.
Okay. All right. Who didn't? Did you? All right, let's hear what you guys say.
Okay, for us, we felt that option 4 wasn't right for a few reasons. One of them is just piggybacking on the point you said, 12 months is just too long to measure an impact of the training. But also more importantly, right, measuring patient outcome as a result of the training on a managerial training, I think is too far-fetched. There are a lot of other factors that affect patient outcome, not just the manager's capacity or skill, right? So, I mean, the other thing is patient satisfaction, right? Although, yes, you could say that if you have a good manager, he could train his people well to provide good services, but also, there are also systemic issues, right, that needs to be addressed, and not just on a direct responsibility of the manager. So, yeah, we felt that option 4 was just
okay. But what I want you all to do is to write down, just one person at your table, just write down the choice that you made. Because I want to make sure that we document this. We're going to go through a little bit of a process here. And then I'm going to return, and I'm going to ask you if you want to change. I'm going to ask you if you want to. So I just want to see if there's a change. So please, someone write down what the table decided on. And we're going to return to it. Okay? So raise your hand if you want to know my choice, what I would choose. All right. Well, you don't get to find out until later. So you gotta stay tuned. I'm not going to tell you until later. All right, so what I do want to do is I want to revisit some of these options. And, you know, by no means are these all the options that are available to you. There are all kinds of things that you could do in this situation. But in general, we have a pretty broad range of different things that we could potentially measure listed out here. So just using this as an example, administering a survey at the end of the course to see whether managers felt the course was effective, we're essentially asking for their subjective opinions about how they liked it. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that, but ultimately, it's about learner satisfaction. So one thing that we could measure is learner satisfaction. Another thing that we can measure is knowledge, which is just recall of information and understanding of concepts and things like that. That's what we have here. Administer a test at the end of the course to measure recall and understanding. Usually whenever we talk about, we're trying to, you know, have someone remember knowledge, or we want to make sure they understand something. Those are words that essentially denote knowledge, recall. We're hoping that they're going to remember information. There's some stuff we want them to remember. And at the end, even though I realized actually when we were soliciting some feedback, there were some comments about this one, but conducting a role play at the end of the course to see if managers can apply the skill is in fact measuring behavior. It's measuring behavior in a classroom environment, but it is still measuring behavior. So behaviors are things that we can measure as well. In option 2, I'm just sort of lumping these together into workplace application. So another thing we can measure is whether people are applying things, whether they're putting them into action at work. So certainly observing them 3 months after training, and maybe at 6 months. There were some comments about whether 3 months was the right period of time, but whatever the period of time is, you know, going out into the field and basically trying to find out whether people are actually using these things, that's another thing that you can essentially try to measure. And in this case, we have 2 different ways of doing that. One is by means of observation, so just looking, having some way of sort of looking, which is a little bit labor intensive and costly to do that. And then another is just simply asking the managers, you know, how are you applying this? To what, you know, how often have you used your skills? Another is work outputs, and this is something that, you know, I don't hear discussed quite as much when it comes to evaluation, but typically, when people are doing work, when they're behaving and they're doing things, they're producing some form of an output. Sometimes the output is tangible, like a microplan, and other times the output is something that's a little bit less tangible, but still possibly measurable, like if you're a sales rep making a sale, or if you're a customer service rep, the impression that you leave with the customer is in fact a work output. So you can measure work outputs. What's the result of someone producing work? And you can look at those work artifacts, whether tangible or not, and try to, you know, measure the effect of someone's behavior on those work outputs. And another are the system impacts. How is the system changing as a result of these things? So in any of these definitions, there can be a bit of fluidity, and there might be, in some cases, something that in some situations would fall into the system impact category, and another that would fall into the work output category, depending on how you define it. But for us, you know, coverage or, you know, wastage rates or whatever, you know, there are a lot of different things that we that we could put into that category, but these are typically things that aren't in reference to a human performance. So usually when we're talking about system impact, if we say, well, the system impact is that we want to have is we want to make sure that our people are, you know, being more friendly to their customers or their, you know, whatever. Well, that's actually not a system impact typically. Maybe if that's the end result that you're going for, that's fine, but it's typically not a system impact because you're still referencing a human. Usually you know that you're dealing with a system impact when you're referring to something that is not human. We increased sales. We can produce our products more efficiently or with less time, etc. So these are the things that we can try to measure along with learning activity. So I've mentioned all of these before: system performance, work product and outputs, workplace application, knowledge or skill, value perception, and then of course learning activity, which is just you know, did you show up and for training? How much time did you spend training? So this is the range of things that we can measure. Now, if you read different models about evaluation and things like that, you'll find a bit of variation in how these things are described, and some of these things might be broken out into multiple categories, et cetera. But ultimately, this is a pretty all-encompassing notion of the things that you can ultimately measure. So the major question that we face when it comes to figuring out how to evaluate is, which of these things do we want to measure? What's the thing that we want to measure? I think a lot of times when we discuss evaluation, we immediately get into these conversations about, like, well, should I do a survey, or should I interview people, or should I, do this or that, or should I observe someone? And those are important questions, don't get me wrong. But in the end, if you don't make this decision correctly, it doesn't really matter. You could survey people or observe whatever, but if you make the wrong decision here, those tactics aren't really going to have, they're of no consequence. So this is really the most important strategic decision that has to be made when it comes to thinking about an evaluation. And it should be mentioned that obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but there are cost versus financial gains for each one of them. And what I mean is that having this knowledge has a certain value to us in certain circumstances. So having knowledge of the system performance has a certain value to us, but acquiring that knowledge has a certain cost. So does the cost outweigh the value, or vice versa? How much money, this is the way of putting it really, is how much money are we willing to pay to achieve this data? Which is the same way of asking, how much do we really value this data? How important is it to us? If you, as a evaluator or as a program owner, value system performance, then getting that gain is how you're going to measure against your cost. So if I spent $1 million on a training program, how do I really tell whether that was worth the cost? I do understand that there are models out there that talk about return on investment, right? But the thing is that the reason that I didn't bring this up is because unless you're training on something that has a quantitative output, sales, production costs, things like that, you're left with deciding what it is that you value. How valuable is it that your customers, your customer service representatives, present a good face, establish maintain the good standing and reputation of your company to the world? How valuable is that to you? That's something that is going to be subjective. And that's the reason why ultimately hard measurements for ROI in so many training programs are very difficult to just put a hard stake in the ground on, because again, unless you are trying to produce in the system something that can be measured objectively and quantitatively, the whole cost versus value has a bit of fluidity to it. So I just wanted to point out that, like I said, there are lots of different ways of thinking about evaluation, and there are lots of different models. And one of the common models is called the Kirkpatrick model. And many of you may have heard of this, and they have the different levels. And Kirkpatrick does use the phrase ROI. But ultimately, there are 4 different levels, and the different items that I see here, you can see line up with the Kirkpatrick levels of evaluation. And yet again, the language might be a little bit different, but ultimately it's, we're functionally talking about the same thing. All right. Everybody clear so far? Yeah? I don't believe you. And so, we're going to play evaluation bingo. Here's what's going to happen. Stakes are high. We got chocolate. Now, here's the deal. So here's what I'm going to present a measure, okay? Like, you know, we're going to test whether someone remembers this or that. And you all are going to have to choose which category it belongs in, which of the, I think there were 8 categories that it belongs in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on you to say bingo if you think you know. So if you know it, just raise your hand or say bingo or something like that. And then I'll call on you. And I'll call on multiple people before I say what the right answer is. In this case, there are right answers. In some cases, there might be multiple right answers, but there are right and wrong answers, okay? So this is another opportunity to earn some chocolate and the respect and esteem of your colleagues, okay? So this is how it's going to work. And I got to think through, how was I going to distribute the chocolate again? All right, so anybody who volunteers, anybody who raises their hand and volunteers to stand up and do this, whether you get it right or wrong, you're going to get a chocolate. Because I feel nice. I feel generous today. All right. Okay, so is everybody ready? Ready. All right. We're going to test whether someone can explain how a vaccine should be administered. Bingo. 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 All right. What's your answer?
Knowledge and skill.
Knowledge and skill. Knowledge and skill. All right, there we go. We had some? All right, knowledge and skill. Okay. Does anyone have anyone pick something different than knowledge and skill? Raise your hand. You gotta step out. All right, what do you have? Knowledge and skill. All right. Who else? All right, we got 2. I'm gonna have to call this. All right. Knowledge and skills. All right, one more over here. Because I know you guys were eager over here. All right, what do you think? Knowledge and skill. Knowledge and skill. Oh, whoops, I'm going to get in front of the... Okay, the answer is knowledge and skill. Now, we had a value perception. Well, I can understand, I can definitely understand your thinking in that regard. And so maybe I can be more clear. When we say value perception, we're not talking about whether someone's perception or conception of the idea is correct. What value perception, and it's good that you brought this up so that I can be more clear about this.
The community, for example,
yes.
Measles can cause blindness if it didn't understand or it didn't perceive that measles are a problem, a big problem.
I see.
So, unless...
Right. So what you're saying, and this is actually quite true, if someone doesn't value, if they don't think that the concept of a particular disease is important, they're just not going to act on it. And that's absolutely true. What we mean by value perception in this case is whether or not the learner thought the training was any good. So they may very well believe wholeheartedly in the concept of the disease and that it's important, and still think that the training wasn't very good. Do you understand what I mean? So they went to training and they thought, this facilitator was bad. I didn't even understand what he was trying to tell me. I really believe that it's super important for me to understand this disease because I need to make sure that everybody in my constituency understands this as well. But this person did not do a good job of helping me understand that. That's a value perception of the training, not necessarily the content. So at least in this case, what I'm talking about when I say value perception is whether you thought that training was any good. Was it delivered to me effectively? Okay. Yes.
I guess I would have done a learning activity because I was being able to explain a concept or recall a concept is a form of learning.
Okay. So this is exactly the reason why we have this activity, by the way, is because these concepts seem straightforward when someone does them, but then when we start applying them, we go, oh, wait a minute, it's not, maybe not quite as clear. So this is showing me that I didn't do a particularly good job of explaining this. So learning activity, in this case, is simply a phrase to refer to whether someone attended something or how much time they spent on it. It doesn't actually refer to whether they learned anything. It's whether they were engaged in the activity. But as we all know, it's entirely possible to go to training and kind of sleep with your eyes open. This is a skill that I've developed over many years, and if anyone wants to know, come and talk to me later, and I will tell you how to sleep with your eyes open. But, we all know that this happens, right? This happens. So you can attend training and not learn anything. So, so that's what we mean by learning activity. So I'm very glad that you brought that up so we could clarify that. So ultimately, when we're talking about did someone learn something, the category, at least in this schematic, in this schema, the category is the knowledge and skill. And when we say learning activity, we're just talking about whether someone showed up, spent 5 hours there, did it 10 times, or whatever. I think my southern accent came out just now. Sorry about that. I grew up in Virginia, so I have a little bit of a... I've been trying for 50 years to scrub that from my speech. All right. Role play a conversation with a care provider. Who knows? All right, we have one. Oh, we got another one here too. Knowledge and skill. Knowledge and skill. Yes. Learning activity. Here we go. Learning activity. Learning activity. Okay. Knowledge and skill. Okay. Knowledge and skill. All right. All right. Everyone wants to. Everyone wants this. All right. We'll get one more over here. All right. And workplace application. Workplace application. We had workplace application, knowledge or skill, and value perception. Or no, not value perception. Yeah, learning activity. That's right, learning activity. Okay. If learning activity simply refers to whether or not you showed up. Did you show up? Did you attend training? How many hours were you there? That's what we mean by learning activity. So if that's what we mean by learning activity, and we do have someone do a role play with a care provider, a fictional care provider, I should have said. Is that learning activity? Who thinks that's learning activity? Who doesn't think that's learning activity? Or who wants to explain to me why they think that's not learning activity? How about over here?
Learning activity is showing up on the training, right? A role play, whether or not you show, if you don't show up, right, you might not have to do the role play. But what's it called? Learning activity is just really focused on taking your attendance. If you attend, you should not attend. I think that's really what it is. So it's not role play.
Okay. Now we also had some people choosing workplace application, and we had some choosing knowledge or skill. For someone who chose knowledge or skill, or someone who thinks that it's knowledge or skill, tell me why you think this may not be workplace application. Yes.
I think that when you're doing a role play,
that's right.
They haven't heard about it. And how I play that role, that's not necessarily that's how I do it when I'm playing my role.
That's right. So in that case, it's not being done in the workplace. And I suppose you could think of it in that way. So when we say workplace application, it would have to actually take place in the workplace. So in this case, the answer is, again, knowledge and skill. We keep landing on knowledge and skill. All right, so the next one here. Assess the quality of patient interactions with a field observation. So in other words, we go into I just want to be clear about this. We go into the field, we observe someone interacting with a patient, And we evaluate that and decide whether it was good or bad somehow. Yes. Workplace application. Here we go. Workplace. You've already gotten some chocolate, haven't you? Workplace. All right. All right, yes. What's that? Work products and outputs. Workplace application. Work products. All right, we're seeing more work products. Who said this? You get another one here. All right, we're gonna stop on this. So work products or workplace application. I put it in both. So you're both right. This is, in fact, a measure of both of those things. If, in fact, you consider, here's where some of the subjectivity kind of comes in. If, in fact, within the context of this organization, producing a patient interaction, a high-quality patient interaction, is considered a work output, then you are, in fact, measuring the work outputs. On the other hand, if a quality patient interaction is seen as a means towards some other end, then you're really talking about workplace application. Satisfaction ratings from patients. System performance? Who thinks it's system performance? Raise your hand. Any other thoughts on this? Work product or outputs? All right, see where there's some subjectivity here? I chose that. But again, if you consider this a system, whoa, wait a minute, how'd they? Oh, wait a minute, I was going the wrong way. I gave up my, well, you know what, it's time for it's time to move on from this anyway. All right, so I think you all get the point. The point of this exercise was just to add a little bit of clarity, or maybe add some confusion, or introduce the idea that there is, at least in some of these, there is a little bit of subjectivity in the categories that these things fall into. Now, I'm going to skip ahead over these. And I had some bonus rounds just in case we needed them, but we're going to skip through those as well. So I think you all are ready now. I have confidence in you guys. All right, so another point that I want to make about these is that they're hierarchical. And all I really mean by that is that in many cases at least, and a lot of things I'm going to say are, sometimes they're exceptions, but one is a precondition of the next. So if we have the expectation that some knowledge or skill, that we're trying to produce some kind of system performance, well, typically that means that we're going to be improving some kind of work output or work product. And in order to do that, we have to see some type of workplace application. In order to do that, we need to see some type of knowledge or skill. And in order to do that, people have to participate in some type of learning activity. And whether or not they see value in that actually is, I would consider, optional. So when I was in my PhD program, I had a friend who insisted, he believed, and he'd been a teacher for many years, he believed that real learning always involves pain. There's no true learning, in his view, that doesn't involve pain. And what I really think he meant by that is that it involves work. It often involves doing things that you don't want to do. So when you measure value, sometimes you learn even though it's not a pleasant experience. So value perception is one area where it may not be a precondition for the others. To learn something may be an unpleasant experience sometimes. Now, of all of these measures, I want to ask you all, and I want to get some input from you all, which of these do you think are the most valuable? Yes?
I think the value of the measure would depend upon sort of the objective of the evaluation. So insofar as you are picking a measure, each of those will give you a different direction of when you're talking about sort of evaluating the learning activity or just knowledge or skill, then perhaps you're saying, was my training effective? But the minute you go into a workplace application, maybe you're looking more in terms of factors of, say, like a post-training support sort of intervention. And, you know, and when you move towards more sort of like work product and outputs as well as sort of system performance as a whole, then maybe work product and outputs is like, what else do you need to apply that training? So for instance, if you're saying that, yes, I have the knowledge and the skills, but do I have, say, the tools to do that task? And if I don't, can that intervention be made to achieve that? And then finally, for system performance, it might be training and then associated factors, inclusive of like other resources, infrastructure, etc. So for each of those sort of buckets, depending upon, I mean, to get a holistic perspective, you could argue that you want to evaluate across all, but whatever the objective of the evaluation is, it'll just give you a different line of intervention.
Okay. And what's your name?
Tanvi.
Tanvi?
Yeah.
Okay. Just, I think, if I'm summarizing correctly, you're saying that the value really depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. If you establish an ambition for achieving a system impact, then system impact is the highest value measure. If, on the other hand, your ambition is simply to increase someone's knowledge and skill, then that's of the highest value. Okay. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts about that, or other comments?
With the knowledge and skill, if I acquire it, it will influence my system performance, it will influence work output, work product and output, and even in my workplace application, it has a lot of influence on them. And for value perception, learning activity, they don't weigh much, but my knowledge and skill is what I know I need to perform my activity.
Okay, thank you.
If I'm to choose one level of evaluation, I would rather choose workplace application.
Workplace application.
Yes, and reason being that in workplace application, it does not just incorporate the knowledge and skill gained, but it also incorporates the commitment of the person who is working. Now, if the person applies those skills effectively and is committed in doing those things he has to do at the workplace, then we'll have it's likely to have work product improvement and consequently system performance improvement. But if it's not applied at the workplace, we need to reevaluate to see if the training was effective. So it's central. You can go backward or forward.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's go over here.
For me, the ultimate objective of whatever endeavor you do is to have a functional system. So whether you are giving people knowledge, you are giving them knowledge because you expect they will do something, and that something will translate into an action, and that action will translate into an outcome. So for me, I think system performance is the goal of whatever action we are doing. Ultimately, all the knowledge, the skills, the application is essentially to have a functional system that meets our long-term objective. So for me, I think the most critical, which is the ultimate objective of all the effort, is system performance.
Okay. All right. These are all very interesting perspectives. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it moving here. But I would say that in my experience, there seems to be an increasing perception of value the further to the left you go. So I'm just saying that when I talk with people, it seems like everybody wants to get to this side here, right? System performance. All right. But a lot of you actually had some different opinions on that. So warning, I am about to maybe challenge some of those assumptions here. All right, so this looks a lot like what I showed yesterday, right? There are lots of things that influence system function. And, processes, culture, tools, resources, money, human behavior. Human behavior is only one of them. It's only one of the things that influences system function. So if the human behavior is perfect, this is similar to what we went through yesterday. If the human behavior is perfect, but some or all of the other components fail, is the system going to work optimally? It's not. Is it the fault of human behavior in this case if the system still fails? No. In many cases, though, if we judged the human behavior in this case, it will appear as though it was a failure. This goes back to the airplane, the CEO airplane thing that we talked about yesterday. Again, this will look familiar, although some of the information is a little bit different, but the point is the same. In the real world, even when you're looking at behavior, the influences on behavior are many. Knowledge and skills are but one component. If someone has the knowledge and skill and the other pieces fail, are they going to behave as we wish? No, they're not. Is this the fault of training? No. What are the implications of this? I'm going to state 3 implications, and I'll let you guys respond to them. We only have 10 minutes. I imagine that what I'm about to say may get some pushback, and that's good. This is a safe place, and discussion is a good thing, and we all love each other. So, knowledge and skills are the only 2 things that are within the control of a trainer and an instructional designer. They don't control the other things that are in the workforce. Those are the only 2 things they can influence. If that's true, and I contend that it is, then the only valid measure of the effectiveness of training is to measure knowledge and skill. Even workplace application is largely outside the influence of a trainer and an instructional designer. I can already see some heads shaking. Implication 2. If a training program was proven to have successfully developed someone's knowledge and skill, but those skills were not then applied in the workplace, the failure is most likely a result of something other than a training failure. I see some heads shaking too, and that's good. If a training program was proven to have successfully developed someone's knowledge and skill, and those skills are being applied in the workplace, but again, system performance is not achieved, it is definitely not the fault of training. It is because someone selected the wrong training to produce. Okay? Which is ultimately an executive leadership failure. Now, before I open this up to discussion, there are a couple of things I want to say. This goes back to one of the things that we have been saying all along. Think of the 70-20-10. In past Teach to Reaches, we've talked about changing our vocabulary from training to performance management. I would go back and revise all of these statements if I wasn't using the phrase training. If my task, if I were accountable for producing improved performance, and I thought of that as my job, then training is but one tool available to me to produce that performance. But the only thing that training can do is increase knowledge and skill. So this does not mean that you can't go out and measure workplace application, system outputs, and things like that. But what it means is that if you see a failure in workplace application, or if you see a failure in system output, it may not be a result of the training. The training worked if you can prove that it developed the knowledge and skill. So, one of the reasons why I'm putting this up here is to reinforce this idea that we need to think beyond training. Now, with all that said, and probably with about 5 minutes left, 6 minutes, I'm going to open up the floor to conversation. You guys, let me have it. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Okay.
Thanks for this stimulating discussion. I think it is really important to recognize that training and other forms of capacity building are only one type of input to effecting change in system performance. But at the same time, it was your implication number one, which I don't know if you can go back to that, that I found kind of troubling. It sort of exonerates the instructional designers and trainers maybe more than is really warranted. The way that training would be approached in a high resource environment as opposed to in a low resource environment really needs to take into account what that environment is, what that workplace situation is, because how those skills are achieved or how they can be practiced may need to be adapted to recognize what that working environment is. And to me, that would seem to be part of the responsibility of the instructional designer, taking that into account, building that into how the training, how that orientation is provided.
You to say, Rebecca, is that ultimately a trainer should be held accountable for giving someone the ability to perform a skill in a particular situation and in a particular context. And I absolutely, fundamentally agree with that. The thing is, they should be able to demonstrate someone, and the only accountability, the only responsibility that a trainer is given, I should say the only authority that a trainer is given, is to test whether people can do that in a training environment. Let's put it, here's another way of thinking about it, and I would encourage people to think in this way. Imagine that you are a training provider, you're an instructional designer, and someone comes to you and they say, I would like you to create training on how to do X, Y, and Z. And it's for people who are going to be doing this in this particular situation. The authority that you're given is to produce training. Unless you negotiate otherwise, you're not given the authority to go out and introduce other interventions. You're not given the authority to, after training, to go out and to provide coaching or to provide coaching programs and things like that. As a consultant, you may attempt to convince your stakeholder to think more broadly and to think in that way, but ultimately, if your job title reads trainer and instructional designer, I can tell you from experience that you're asked to produce training. If your job is broader than that, if you're a performance consultant and the task that someone has given you is, we want you to solve a performance problem, then I totally agree that ultimately you will be and should be held accountable for what happens in the workplace. But so often when we limit our minds to training and instructional design, and that's all that we're thinking about, the only thing that you can produce is instruction. And so you have to produce instruction that does that. So it confines what you're able to do. The authority afforded a trainer and an instructional designer is very limited.
Sorry, just one quick comment. I think for me, in addition to knowledge and skills, I also think that motivation is something that a trainer can influence, particularly in the public sector as opposed to the private sector that's perhaps more motivated by sales figures. I think the trainer is a role model and can consciously or subconsciously influence the trainees that way. So I think motivation here is an additional factor that I would probably include.
Agreed, good point. All right, so one more comment and then we're gonna close it up here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to disagree with you in saying that the instructional designer doesn't have anything. I mean, it's just about training and then whatever happens after that. In designing, the training and having the designer doing that, you have to ultimately look at the person, what is expected of the person to get from the training. Therefore, you take it down to where the person is going to use that. So you have to break it down. If you break it down and say, okay, the person has to know this to be able to do this, and you don't know, that the person doesn't have the tools to do that, and you go ahead and train or do that, then there's been a failure. If a person doesn't perform, then there's a failure with the trainer or an instructional designer.
And I agree with that 100%. If we think of training as providing a bunch of information, But that's not the way that I think of training. And that's not, I don't think, the way that training should be thought of. The way that training should be designed is you should think about how are people going to apply this in the workplace, and you should create a training environment that simulates that as much as possible. So when we say knowledge and skill, so it is 100% a failure for the trainers and the instructional designers if they have not provided the opportunity for someone to practice and demonstrate mastery of a skill, at least in a simulated workplace environment. So as long as we're thinking about training as an environment where someone stands up and presents some slides, then I do agree that that is a training failure. But that isn't really what training should be. Training should be, it should acknowledge the environment in which these skills are going to be used, and it should provide an environment where people can practice in a simulated situation that has as much proximal similarities to the real world environment. And so we've got to close this up, but one last comment.
This moment, because that's why I had my hand up. The reason, what I'm worried about is the great temptation that I have seen in multiple projects I've worked on where there is a post-test given like on Friday afternoon, and which is this, administered after the pre-test that had been given on Monday morning. Scores go up and everyone's happy and people say knowledge and skills are increased. And we all know that once the person leaves the room, they will begin forgetting, and they might not even remember it by Monday. So it's an invalid measure. And the other thing is that working in immunization is actually the knowledge and skills that people need for most of the jobs that are required are actually a combination of knowledge and skills and the analytical ability to determine which skill to use at that moment. So the complexity of showing a competency or any kind of real simulation of a realistic achievement of knowledge and skills to do their job is really hard to test in the classroom environment. So that's what I'm a little worried about. Actually, if we had distance learning and virtual reality where we could simulate the actual circumstance, then we'd be able to feel better about knowledge and skills. And so I'm just really worried that the takeaway message here is going to be, if we do a post-test and our scores go up by Friday afternoon, then we're good. And I really don't want people to get that message.
Okay. And she loves me dearly. That makes me feel better, because I was kind of sad after that. So I don't know about elsewhere, but in the U.S., there's this phrase that you hear, particularly regarding primary education, that's called teaching to the test. And it's considered a very negative phrase. So it's usually referring to this phenomena where some governmental entity, a state or a federal government, devises a test, and then it says all the schools have to give the kids this test at the end of the year, and the teacher's pay is going to be affected by the test. And so the net consequence is that the teachers don't bother really thinking about the rich education, and they just teach to try to prepare kids for the test. So there's this culture of teach to the test is a negative term. And so what I will say is that teaching to the test is exactly what everyone should be doing if you have the right test. The problem in that situation is that you probably don't have the right test. If we think of, and the test should be defined by the behaviors that we're looking for. And this goes right back to what we talked about with the whole person learning. If we're going to produce behaviors, we have to have a thorough understanding of the behaviors that we're looking for. As Julie said, we have to be able to observe those behaviors, and being able to observe them is in fact a test. So if we think of the test as, here's a multiple choice test that someone has to take, teaching to the test may result in very information-centric instruction. On the other hand, if the test is, go create a microplan and let's see how good it is, or let's go have you talk to someone in a simulated environment and we're going to measure that and see how that is. Those are the sorts of tests that are accurate reflections of the behaviors people are going to be exhibiting in the workforce. And if we've designed those tests, then we should be teaching to those tests. So when I say knowledge and skill, that's what's behind that. So as to mitigate Denise's concern, I want to be ultimately clear about that what I'm not talking about is we just give a paper and pencil multiple choice test and we're all good to go, because that's not what I'm talking about. All right, so in closing, I will say that what I wanted to leave you all with was having critically thought about this. It's not really particularly important, to me at least, whether or not you agree with everything that was said here. But I just wanted to get you all thinking about it. You can form your own views about it. There are varying viewpoints on how this should work and what's important and how to apply effort. But the critical thing here is that this choice about what to measure is the most important choice that you're going to make when it comes to evaluating the effectiveness of any kind of performance intervention or a training plan or anything like that. Once you've made that, the other decisions like whether we use a survey or whether we interview people or whether we observe them, those are important decisions as well, but those will fall into place afterwards. Okay? So, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time and effort and attention.